Muchas gracias por estar aquí, a todos, a todas. Gracias también a Paula Pico, que es la directora de la carrera de Filosofía, por estar. Gracias, Paula, que dio hace unos días la clase inaugural de este año. Quiero agradecer a Dan Zahavi de estar con nosotros. Yo conocí su obra estando en la Universidad en Leeds, en Inglaterra. Estaba trabajando sobre la relación entre Meister Eckhart y Søren Kierkegaard. Y a propósito de esos tópicos, di con la obra de Dan y me resultó muy estimulante. Y conversamos sobre eso con Maximiliano Kladakis, que está aquí con nosotros, quien también conocía la obra de Dan por sus trabajos sobre fenomenología, y nos pareció interesante tomar el atrevimiento y la osadía de invitarlo, y quiero agradecer su generosidad para estar desde Copenhague con nosotros aquí. Antes de darle un segundo la palabra a Maximiliano, yo quiero decir por qué a mí, después va a decir por qué a él nos resultó muy sugerente y provocador para nosotros la obra de Dan. Más allá de los tópicos en los cuales él ha centrado su obra, a mí me parece que para nosotros tiene una primera particular relevancia su trabajo por su capacidad de enfocar un tema y realizar una tras otra preguntas, interrogaciones, problematizar un tópico, construir un conjunto, una red de cuestiones en torno a ella, con la cual poder abordar la literatura vinculada a ese tema. Esa capacidad de centrarse no solamente en un autor, sino fundamentalmente en un tópico, y en este caso, en su obra, los textos que yo he leído de él sobre el sí mismo, la conciencia de sí, o en este caso la relación entre el nosotros y el yo y el tú, me parece que esto es, para nuestro pequeño centro, es muy significativo en la línea hacia donde quisiéramos ir, que también implica un cruce de diversas disciplinas. No sé, Maximiliano, ¿qué querés agregar?
Sí, quiero agregar, ¿no? Que tenemos frente a nosotros, o con nosotros en esta modalidad de Zoom, a un profesor, a un estudioso, e incluso más aún a un pensador de una envergadura que en lo particular considero incuestionable. Mi acercamiento a la obra de Dan Zahavi, por un lado viene desde los tiempos de la escritura de la tesis de licenciatura, en sus trabajos, quizás en un primer momento, trabajar sobre otros autores, una problemática que va desplegándose a lo largo de su obra, que es el problema de la intersubjetividad y la relación entre intersubjetividad y subjetividad. Textos sobre Sartre, sobre Husserl, sobre Merleau-Ponty, lecturas muy profundas, muy sugerentes. Antes de la apertura general le comenté al profesor que creo que el texto que más cité en mi pequeño labor académico es un trabajo de él sobre Sartre. Casi siempre está citado en algún trabajo que yo haga. Eso por un lado. Y por otro lado, el desafío, el valor que tiene nuestro profesor, nuestro intelectual, de abordar la problemática de la intersubjetividad, poniendo en diálogo, más allá, como dijo Carlos, de la lectura de autores, poner en diálogo la fenomenología con disciplinas como la filosofía analítica, la psiquiatría, la psicología quizás de carácter cognitivo-conductual, y leer su obra más allá de los comentarios a otros autores, nos sumerge en este desafío que traspasa, ¿no?, nuestras especializaciones. Y repito, es un honor tenerlo acá, estar con él, poder compartir un tiempo con él.
Gracias Maxi, gracias Carlos. Entonces ahora, para dar inicio a este encuentro en su parte ya teórica, por decirlo así, y de intercambio, les vamos a solamente explicar que tienen, como decíamos hace un rato, en la barra de abajo de sus computadoras, de sus pantallas, tienen un símbolo que es un mundo donde pueden elegir el idioma en el cual quieren escuchar el encuentro y participar de él. ES significa español, EN significa inglés. Con esto damos entonces inicio a la presentación que Marina va a hacer del profesor Zahavi, a quien le volvemos a agradecer esta invitación, y entonces largamos nomás.
Thank you, Dan. We've been exchanging lots of emails. It's real generosity that you're here out of your generosity. And I will briefly present you because everybody has spoken a lot about you. So, Dan Zahavi is a professor of philosophy and the director of the Center for Subjectivity Research at the University of Copenhagen. Zahavi's primary research area is phenomenology and philosophy of mind, and their intersection with empirical disciplines such as psychiatry and psychology. In addition to a number of scholarly works on the phenomenology of Husserl, Zahavi has mainly written on the nature of selfhood, self-consciousness, intersubjectivity, empathy, and most recently on topics in social ontology. His most important publications include Self-Awareness on Alterity, 1999-2020, Husserl's Phenomenology, 2003, Subjectivity and Selfhood, 2005, The Phenomenological Mind, together with Sean Gallagher, 2008-2012, Self and the Other, 2014, Husserl's Legacy, 2017, and Phenomenology, The Basics, 2019. Since 2020, Dan Zahavi has been the principal investigator on a 5-year research project entitled Who Are We?, which is supported by the European Research Council and the Carlsberg Foundation. Zahavi's writings have been translated into more than 30 languages. Welcome, Zan.
Thank you so much. I will try to see if I can share something here. Is this visible to everybody? Super.
Yes.
Wonderful. So let me just start by expressing my gratitude for these extremely flattering introductory words, and I'm very pleased that I've been invited, and I very much look forward to sharing some of my current ideas with you. And so, in fact, what I'm going to present today is very much ongoing work. I'm basically going to try to present some of the guiding ideas behind this big new research project that I'm engaged in, which is also supposed to lead towards a new book that is going to come out with Oxford University Press with the title Who Are We? Now, I won't be able to kind of present all the details, obviously, and I'm not really going to be able to present all the results either, since it's still a book that I'm working on and I haven't finished it yet. But at least I will be able to say something about the framework and also something about the kind of guiding.
Oh, porque antes comía jamón.
Guiding ideas.
Me parece muy bien.
I think
Comelo.
somebody is Good. Okay. About the some of the guiding ideas behind that project. So let's just get started. I think that the capacity to engage in collective intentionality is a very fundamental feature of ordinary human life. I mean, every day we enjoy events together, we can solve problems together, we can make plans together. And just as we can engage in those kinds of specific events, we are also able to share collective identities and responsibilities and traditions and customs. And all of this has been kind of captured under the heading collective intentionality. And if one looks at work coming out during the last 20, 30 years, it will be clear that quite a number of different disciplines have been interested in the topic, not just philosophers, but also social psychologists, developmental psychologists, economists, people working in neuroscience, and many other disciplines. Now, what I find interesting is that many of the empirical disciplines have actually drawn on philosophical work as well. And typically, the inspiration is coming from analytic philosophy and primarily from a very small group of thinkers, namely Searle, Bradman, Gilbert, and Tumula. I mean, these are the four analytic philosophers that have really shaped the contemporary discussion of collective intentionality. Now, what is characteristic of these four thinkers? Well, I think one characteristic is that they often focus on collective action, on joint action. They ask the question, how is it possible to do different things together, go for a walk together, paint a house together, prepare food together, carry a piano together. And the big question that is then being discussed is the question of whether such collective intentions can be reduced to individual intentions, or whether we have to accept the existence of irreducible collective intentions or irreducible we intentions. Now, I think these are all very important questions, but I also think that this focus on action is a bit narrow and that it actually leaves a number of important questions unexplored. Let me mention three sets of questions that I think are very important. First, what is the relation between collective identity and self-identity? Or what is the relationship between the we and the I? So one way to talk about that is to ask, I mean, whether we can really understand what it means to be part of a we if we don't understand what it means to be a self. And likewise, is the fact that we can identify with a group, is the fact that we can adopt a group identity, does that not tell us something important about the nature of selfhood? The second question is, how is collective intentionality related to social cognition and interpersonal understanding? And here again, one might ask, how could we possibly understand what it means to share perspective with others if we do not have a proper account of how we come to understand others in the first place? In addition, one might also say that we can in fact understand others in many different ways. And one intriguing question is whether some types, some forms of interpersonal understanding might be more important for the emergence of a we perspective than others. And finally, we also have to consider the fact that a we is not just one thing. There's actually quite a number of different types of we's. Some we's are transient, some are more persisting. Some are very small, they can be dyadic, others are much larger. What is the relationship between a dyad and a crowd, an association, a business association, and a community? Do all of these formations exemplify we's? And if yes, which of these we's are then most fundamental? So these are all questions that I think are important to discuss and address if one talks about collective intentionality. And more overarching, I think that if we want to think about the we also have to think about the self and about social relations, because all of these questions kind of hang together, and our answer to some of these questions will have an impact on our answer to other questions. I mean, if one doesn't think there is any self, if one is defending a no-self doctrine, or if one thinks that there is a self and it's bodily grounded and experientially grounded, or if one thinks that the self is a social construction, I mean, depending on which of these three positions one take, one will have different views on the nature of the we. And likewise, one's view on interpersonal understanding will also have important implications for one's approach to the we. Is it possible to understand others? Is it possible to experience others? Or is the mental and experiential life of others completely invisible, completely impenetrable? I mean, depending on these two positions, I mean, the possibility of shared emotions, shared experiences, a shared perspective on the world will also look very different. And likewise, the influence also goes the other way. I mean, if one acknowledges that there is something like genuine we experiences, genuine we perspectives, genuine we intentions, I mean, that is also going to put pressure on various traditional conceptions about the self and social cognition. So I think all of these questions are interrelated, and it would be a problem if one were trying to discuss the we and didn't also at the same time investigate the nature of selfhood and the nature of interpersonal understanding. Now, it's one thing to talk about the way in which collective intentionality is currently investigated in analytic philosophy of mind, but one could of course point to the social sciences, political theory, sociology, social psychology, anthropology, and kind of draw inspiration from their very rich discussion of community and the nature of the we. And certainly the considerations that one can find in the social sciences concerning the relationship between self and society goes far beyond discussions of whether our ability to paint a house together can be reduced to my intention to paint the house and your intention to paint the house. I mean, that kind of philosophical discussion might be very rewarding, but there really is a much broader and much more profound way of discussing the nature of the relationship between self and community that one can find in the social sciences. The problem, however, is that as much as the social sciences offer us rich accounts, what one do not find typically in the social sciences are very profound explorations of consciousness, bodily self-experience, the nature of social cognition. I mean, that's not typically what they are interested in. And so to quote a well-known Norwegian social anthropologist, when we talk of identity in social anthropology, we refer to social identity and not the depth of the individual mind. So there's a limit to how many resources one can find in the social sciences if one wants to supplement the investigation found in contemporary analytic discussions of collective intentionality. So what should we do? Now, the contemporary analytic discussion of collective intentionality has only lasted a few decades. One of the kind of very influential books that kind of triggered this interest in collective intentionality was Searle's book, The Construction of Social Reality. And in that book, Searle claimed that the great philosophers, sociologists from the early 20th century hadn't had the adequate tools to really engage with the problem of collective intentionality. And the reason why they didn't have the tools, according to Searle, was because they lacked a proper account of intentionality. Now, for those of you familiar with Searle's work, you will know that Searle, before writing The Construction of Social Reality, had already written another book called Intentionality. And of course, his point would be that because of this previous work on the nature of consciousness, the nature of intentionality, he had the tools and the ability to also investigate collective intentionality. Now, when talking about the great classical philosophers, sociologists, Searle refers to the work of Weber, Simmel, and Durkheim. What is a bit odd about this list is that there is a figure lacking, namely Alfred Schütz. And what is interesting about Schütz is that his most famous book, Der sinnhafte Aufbau der sozialen Welt, I mean, if one were to translate that into English, it could almost sound like the title of Searle's own book. But there are more similarities between Schütz and Searle than just the title of their books. Now, what we find in Schütz is actually something very akin to what Searle is doing, because what Schütz was trying to do in Der sinnhafte Aufbau was basically to address foundational issues in sociology by using a phenomenological method and by drawing on Husserl's theory of intentionality. So Schütz did precisely have a theory of intentionality available in his attempt to address foundational sociological problems. And it turns out that Schütz was not the only one, because Schütz was basically continuing a long tradition in phenomenology for addressing and investigating the nature of community, the nature of the collective, the nature of tradition and social experience by phenomenological means. And I think if one looks at the publications of early phenomenologists, I mean, one will discover a very rich amount of resources, basically in the time space from shortly before the First World War and until the early 30s. So there's about 20 years of work where a lot of phenomenologists were kind of departing from an investigation into the structure of consciousness into a discussion of dyadic, intersubjective experience, and using those kinds of resources to illuminate basically the nature of social reality, the nature of community, the nature of communal experience, and the we. Now, what I want to do in what follows, and that kind of coincides with the work I'm doing in Copenhagen, and also the book that I'm writing on, is to present to you some ideas that can be found in these phenomenological authors that address the three questions that I was kind of formulating: the relationship between we and I, the relationship between we and you, and the varieties of we. And of course, I mean, it's impossible for me to exhaust or do justice to all these works, but I will just pick out some ideas that I personally find very intriguing and promising, and which also, as I said, were guiding the kind of work that we are doing in Copenhagen. And perhaps, hopefully, that will give you an impression of some of this richness of that discussion. So let me start with the first question, the question concerning the we and the I. Now, one fundamental question to ask really concerns the question of what has primacy. I mean, does the we presuppose a plurality of pre-existing selves, or is it rather the other way around? Does individual subjectivity presuppose some kind of pre-existing community? Now, in order to address that question, we need to look more carefully at what a we is. And here are two ideas. I mean, a we is a first person plural pronoun. And if we look at the first person character, what I think that highlights is that a we is something that requires an experiential grounding. I mean, to be part of a we is something that has to be experienced from within. It's not something you can be assigned to by external forces completely independently of your own experiential life or position. A we, however, is also plural. It's something that requires plurality. And one way to understand that is by saying that a we can never be some kind of fusional, undifferentiated unity. A we is really something that requires a preservation of plurality. I mean, it does also, of course, involve some kind of unity, some kind of connection, but that connection can never be a seamless unity, because then it would cease being a we. A we has to have and preserve this difference. So again, one way to put it is to say that a we is a specific way of being with one another. And that, of course, also articulates the preservation of a certain difference. And that difference, again, must be bridged. It mustn't be eradicated or dissolved or erased. Now, on the basis of that kind of considerations, I think one has to reject the idea that it's the we that gives rise to individual subjectivity, because insofar as the we requires a plurality of subjects, I mean, those subjects have to be presupposed. And I think that is an idea that one can find proposed by a number of phenomenologists. So Hannah Arendt, who of course is a little bit later, she actually argued that togetherness and cooperation require preservation of diversity and should ultimately be understood as a paradoxical plurality of unique beings. Whereas Husserl at one point argues that plurality lies at the heart of communal life. It's a unity founded in multiplicities. Now, here's an additional point that also highlights what is specific about a we. One might be a member of many different groups or social categories, completely regardless of one's own view on the matter. I mean, my ethnicity is not something that I decide myself. The family that I'm born into, again, is one that I belong to, whether I want it or not. But I think being part of a we is really something that requires a subjective affirmation and appropriation. And if you don't self-identify as a member of a group, you won't be part of that we. So again, this continues what I was saying a moment ago. In order to be member of a we, or in order to have a first person plural perspective, this is something that involves rather than bypasses the self-understanding and the first person perspective of the involved participants. Now, when one is a part of a we, this is really something that makes an experiential difference. It transforms one's sense of self and one's relation to others and the way one experiences the world. And I think that one of the intriguing phenomenological questions is, what kind of processes must be in place in order for me to start to view myself or understand myself or feel as part of a larger we? What kind of processes can trigger that transformation? How is it that one can come to think and experience oneself as one of us? Now, I will return to that specific question in the second section on the relationship to the you. But right now, I want to focus a bit more on the question concerning the relationship between self and self-experience. Because what is a self? What is a self-experience? Again, I think we need some answers to those questions if we want to understand what a we is. Now, for Husserl, there are many different levels and different types of self. On the one hand, Husserl would say, if we investigate consciousness, our experiences are never anonymous, they are not ownerless, they always require a subject. One might say they always come with a point of view. And so one way to understand Husserl's reasoning here is to say that for him, our experiential life is individuated. So there is a specific minimal form of selfhood present in experience from the very start. However, Husserl is also very clear that that minimal conception of self is not identical with human selfhood in its full flourishing. And so if we want to do justice to human selfhood, Husserl would argue it's not enough just to look at the structure of experience, rather we need to look at the normative dimension. We need to look at convictions, commitments, decisions we make, because they are what forms us as persons. They are what provides us with a personal identity. And so Husserl would argue precisely that by committing to specific values, by leading a life in accordance with specific norms, I can come to be a personal ego or personal self. I can come to be a more robust kind of self than the kind of self I am simply in virtue of being an experiencer. And of course, that whole process of acquiring norms and living a life in accordance with the specific values is not something that I just do in isolation. It's very much something I'm brought into as a result of my upbringing. It's very much a result of my socialization. So there's a very important role for my community to play here. I think that Husserl would argue that close personal relationships are crucial for the development of selfhood. And I also think he would say that if we want to understand what is required for our membership of more robust and enduring communities, the kind of self that we need to look at is exactly this more normatively enriched kind of self. So were we only experiential selves, were we merely subjects of experience, I don't think we could really become members. I don't think we could become community members. But at the same time, Husserl is also insistent that when it comes to this very fundamental level of selfhood, this is really one that is intrinsic to consciousness. It's not one that is socially derived or socially constructed. And I think that plays in when Husserl insists upon the importance of plurality for an understanding of community, because he would precisely argue that this fundamental individuation of consciousness, the fact that that fundamental level of selfhood is not socially derived, that is actually a precondition for being able to be together with others in a way that allows for community to be established. And let me just give you one quote where Husserl says something along these lines. In a certain sense, the individuality of souls implies an unbridgeable separation, that is, a being different from one another and a being external to one another in the logical and not spatial sense. That can never lead to a continuous connection, and connection that would be a continuous flowing into one another. But as he then continues, on the other hand, this separation does not prevent, but is rather the condition of possibility for monads to be able to coincide and thus be in community with one another. So what Husserl is really saying is we have to accept, or we have to, the fact that selves on the fundamental level are separated and cannot fuse, cannot constitute one common stream of consciousness, is not a problem, but rather a prerequisite for proper community life. So what I wanted to say by this is basically that what we find in phenomenology are precisely reflections on the nature of selfhood, and I mean, in a way that goes over and above a kind of technical discussion of whether our intentions are reducible whether collective intentions are reducible to we intentions. Or to put it differently, I mean, when engaging with problems concerning the we, Husserl is not merely talking about how to analyze, you know, the case of painting a house together or cooking food together. I mean, as interesting as that might be, he's really going into a very fundamental analysis of the structure of consciousness. And I think that precisely is something that we have to bring in if we want to have a profound understanding of the nature of collective intentionality. Okay, let me move on to the second part, we and you. Now, thinking about the we, it's not enough just to think about the relationship between I and we. Why not? Because a we obviously involves more than just one person. And so we need to look at the relationship between the members or the participants if we are to understand the nature of a we. And I think one interesting question is, well, how are these members supposed to relate to each other if they are to constitute a we together, if they are to share something together? Now, if one looks at standard accounts of collective intentionality, I mean, they often don't engage very much with the problem of social cognition, but if they do, they often tend to adopt a fairly intellectualist and cognitivist take on social cognition, and talk of social cognition in terms of inferential mind reading or in terms of complex, meta representations. Now, if we go to the phenomenologists in contrast, we find a different view. What many phenomenologists would argue would be that empathy is the kind of crucial stepping stone to an investigation of we intentionality. But what does empathy mean? Well, in phenomenology, the term empathy has a fairly specific meaning. Empathy is not a question of imaginative perspective taking, about imagining what it must be like to be in another person's shoes, nor is empathy about sharing the very same emotion as somebody else. No, for the phenomenologists, empathy is an experiential encounter with the other, a kind of perceptual acquaintance with the other. Sometimes one also talks about social perception. So it's a specific type of intentionality that is really directed at foreign experiences in a way that preserves the foreignness or otherness of those experiences and doesn't transform them into becoming one's own experiences. Now, what can also be found in the phenomenological literature, however, is an important distinction between unidirectional and bidirectional empathy. To put it more in kind of ordinary language, I mean, there's a difference between watching someone unobserved, that would be unilateral empathy, and realizing that one's attention is being noticed and reciprocated. And here's a quote, another quote from Husserl, where Husserl says, "A special and very important case of the experience of empathy in which another person is given to me as one who in turn is directed at a second person, consists in the case that I myself am co-experienced as this second person." So again, what we should imagine is I'm empathizing with somebody who on his behalf is directed at another subject. And in this specific case, the other subject that the person I'm empathizing with is directed at is myself. In that case, I experience the other person sitting opposite me as one who is directed at myself in his experience. And then the important point comes. Hence, on the basis of this most originary form of being for one another reciprocally, the manifold I-you acts and we acts become possible. So what Husserl seems to be saying is that reciprocal or bidirectional empathy is crucial for the I-you relation and for the we. So let's take a closer look at that. What does it mean to relate to another as a you, and why might that be important for the emergence of a we? I think that the important difference between relating to somebody as a you and relating to somebody as a he or she is that when I relate to somebody as a you, I'm relating to somebody who is at the same time related to me as a you. So there can't really just be one you, there always have to be at least two. What this also means is that when I'm relating to somebody as a you, I'm not just aware of that person, because that person is aware of me at the same time. And when I'm aware of that person, I'm also aware indirectly of myself as well, as being attended to or as being addressed by the other. So one way to formulate that is that second person engagement relating to the other as a you is a special kind of social understanding or interpersonal understanding that goes hand in hand with a special kind of self-consciousness, namely a self-experience that is enriched or transformed by incorporating an external perspective, namely the perspective of the person that I'm currently addressing. And interestingly, one can find a number of phenomenologists who have argued that that kind of second-person relation is really crucial for the development of a we. Here's a quote by Buber. I mean, Buber is not strictly speaking a phenomenologist, but of course his book, The I-Tao, was absolutely crucial for influencing the discussion of you relations. And here's what Buber says. He says, only men who are capable of truly saying thou to one another can truly say we with one another. But Buber is not the only person who highlights the relationship between the you and the we. Let me give you two quotes from Schütz as well. Schütz says, I take up an other orientation toward my partner, who is in turn oriented toward me. Immediately and at the same time, I grasp the fact that he on his part is aware of my attention to him. In such cases, I, you, we live in the social relationship itself. And here's another quote by Schütz as well, when he says, in the we relation, our experiences are not only coordinated with one another, but also reciprocally determined and related to one another. I experience myself through my consociate, and he experienced himself through me. The mirroring of self in the experience of the stranger is a constitutive element of the we relation. So I think what is very nicely pointed out by Schütz here is the way in which my relation to another, and indirectly my transformed self-experience, that is transformed as a relationship, that is transformed in virtue of my relationship to the other, how both of those experiences kind of infuse what he then calls a we relationship. Now, one final thing about the you-we relation, and then I will move to the final part of my talk. What we also find in phenomenology is a focus on shared affects. Rather than focusing so much on action, which, as I have already said, is a feature of analytic discussions, there has been a lot of focus on passion, on affects. So here's a possible case of emotional sharing. Imagine that you have been to the cinema with a friend, and afterwards you encounter your mother, and you then say to her, we really enjoyed the movie. Now, why are you using the term we here? The reason that you're using the term we is intended to capture more than simply the fact that there was a common object. You and your friend didn't simply happen to enjoy the movie side by side. No, you enjoyed it together. And although you didn't see the movie through your friend's eyes, it's having been seen by him as part of the experience you have of it. That's why you decide to use the term we when explaining to your mother what has just gone on. What many of the phenomenologists would argue is that in order to account for such shared emotions, it's not enough just to have individual experiences plus a bit of additional knowledge. No, what we have to have are experiences that are very tightly interlinked. We have to have experiences that are constitutively interdependent and co-regulated. And what does that mean? Well, it basically means that when we have experiences together, we are having experiences that we could not have had on our own, but which we are only having in virtue of the specific relationship we are standing in. And those kinds of experiences are precisely also experiences that transform the very ownership in question. Shared experiences are not just experienced by me as my experiences or yours experiences, but precisely as our experiences. And again, this highlights the need for looking at that transformation of subjectivity that occurs in we experiences, which is what I think the phenomenologists have done. Okay, on to the final part. Again, there are a lot of people from early phenomenology who have worked on these topics. Here's a phenomenologist, a sociologist that is not, I think, very well known. But what we find in Vierkant's work is is again a lot of descriptive distinctions. So here are two examples that he uses. Imagine first a case where a number of pedestrians who are accidentally in the same place suddenly encounter an escaped lion. Now, all of them, for whatever strange reasons, are armed, and they realize that they will have a better chance of killing this dangerous lion if they decide to cooperate. And as a result of that cooperation, they form a group, but it's a group with a very narrow focus and limited duration. The moment they have killed the lion together, the group will cease to exist. Compare that to another form of group. This is a platoon of soldiers united by a strong esprit de corps, and they have the goal of hunting down an enemy. Now, the soldiers very much feel and identify as group members, and the goal they pursue is a collective goal. It's not just an individual goal that they want to realize by collaborating with others. No, it's the goal of the group. Now, what one finds in many of the phenomenologists drawing on the sociological work of Quiénes is basically a distinction between two very different group formations. On the one hand, we have groups that come about because individuals join forces, because it serves their own individual interests. And on the other hand, we have groups where the members are bound together by mutual concerns and solidarity, and who really understands themselves as members of the we. So their self-identity is bound up with this collective identity. Now, the platoon that I just mentioned is obviously a very closely knit group. In contrast to the arbitrary case of pedestrians who just find themselves by accident together. And one interesting feature of such closely knit groups is that it can persist even if some of its members are replaced. Imagine that one of the soldiers is killed, another soldier replaces him. Now, that doesn't mean that the platoon is suddenly a completely different platoon. It's still the same platoon because it can persist changes of members, because it's bound together by certain norms, traditions, rules, etc. Now, there are other group formations that can be descriptively analyzed, which are different from such a group, the platoon group. And here's a case, again, coming back to Husserl, who talks about love. And so here's a quote from one of his unpublished manuscripts. Two people who form a unit of life, not two lives side by side, but two people, two persons, each of whom lives his or her own life, and yet also shares in the life of the other, a co-life, a life of its own that connects with the other's own life, embraces it, and is embraced by it. The principle of this most intimate unity is to be determined. This most intimate unity of two-ness is to be described in more detail. So again, this is a description of a group, a dyadic group, which of course is very different from, again, what might happen if two people has to carry a furniture from one place to another. And again, we can analyze the intentions involved in moving a piece of furniture together. But that kind of very short-lived dyadic we is very different from the we constituted by two romantic partners. And if we want to understand what a we is, we need to investigate many different types. What we also need to recognize, and what I think the phenomenologists have been attentive to, is the fact that on the one hand, there are groups that comes together in terms of direct communication, but of course, there are also groups that are not immediately tied to bodily interaction in the here and now. I mean, I might, for instance, identify myself as a member of a specific religious community, and I might then identify with other members of the same community and have group-based experiences even if I'm alone. I mean, for instance, I might have received the news that members of my religious community are persecuted, and I might then feel outrage. And I mean, that feeling is very much a group-based feeling. I'm feeling what I'm feeling because I take myself to be a member of that specific group. So if one wants to investigate the we, it's not enough just to look at dyadic interaction. It's not enough just to look at people who are interacting in a common space and time. I mean, we also need to look at we's that are linked by heritage and culture, by convention, norms, and institutions. And again, this is something that phenomenologists have also done in the work of Gerda Walter. We can, for instance, find a distinction between what she calls Lebensgemeinschaften and gegenständliche Gemeinschaften, or life communities and objectual communities. And this is basically a difference between, on the one hand, a friendship that doesn't have an external goal, but where the only goal is, so to speak, the flourishing of that friendship itself. And Walter contrasts that with a kind of community that is organized around specific external objects. I mean, it might be, for instance, a religious monument or a sacred place, or it could be a football stadium. I mean, where certain environmental features are somehow organizing or structuring the community in question. I think I will just drop those references to Tomasello and then just move on to one of my final slides. I think all the phenomenologists would argue that socialization and inculturation is something that really expands the type of we can be a member of. But I also think that most of them would insist that it all starts with an engagement with particular others. I mean, this is very clear, I think, in the work of Schütz, who says that the face-to-face relationship, which he calls the living we relationship, is a directly experienced kind of sociality that really provides the basis for our ability to engage with a much wider social world, including engaging with and seeking to understand people who are far removed from me in both space and time. So I do think that many phenomenologists, not all of them, Heidegger is a famous exception, but I don't have time to discuss him today. Many phenomenologists would argue that dyadic face-to-face interaction is really crucial, and that we need to consider that if we want to understand larger groups. But I don't think one should misunderstand the claim. The claim is not that larger communities can be understood simply as summations of dyads. No, I think the point that the phenomenologists are making is somewhat different. I think what they are saying is that the cognitive and affective capacities, or basically the structures of intentionality, are changed and transformed as a result of dyadic encounters in such a way that more complex types of group identification and group formations become possible. And that's why we need to look and explore the dyad. But I mean, all of them certainly do recognize that, community membership and being part of a we isn't just a question of, from time to time, suddenly teaming up with another individual. No, we are in a much more profound way formed by the community we are part of, and we are carriers of a tradition as a result of our socialization that also makes us into members of a we. So to conclude and to kind of just return to where I started, if one looks at the influential contribution of the analytic philosophers who are working on collective intentionality, well, as I've already said, I mean, many of them are really focusing rather narrowly on the question of agentive intentions or joint action. And as I have hoped that I have been able to show, what one can find in classical phenomenology is really a much wider discussion that also includes considerations of emotions, perceptions, traditions, and identities. And in fact, I think that one of the key features of phenomenological sociology is that it precisely does what I think hasn't been done in contemporary debates, namely trying to bring together a discussion of collective intentionality with a discussion of selfhood, self-experience, and interpersonal understanding. I mean, all of these things are basically explored in a kind of mutually enriching way. And as I've also tried to illustrate, I mean, even though many of the phenomenologists do pay a lot of attention to dyadic interaction, many of the phenomenologists have certainly also spent time trying to analyze what role habits, norms, and conventions are playing when we are talking about more enduring types of we's. If one looks at the development in both cognitive science and also, I think, analytic philosophy of mind over the last 20 years, I think discussions on both social cognition and self-consciousness have shifted somewhat. And I think that an important reason for that shift has really been the kind of appeal to classical phenomenological discussions of these topics. I think one can witness that in the domain of cognitive science and philosophy of mind. And what I'm kind of hoping might occur as a result of this renewed interest in early phenomenological work on community and on social ontology is that a kind of comparable impact might happen, not just vis-a-vis analytic philosophy of mind, but also vis-a-vis discussions going on in the social sciences that so far have primarily been drawing on the analytic discussion of joint action. And I think there's a lot of resources and a lot of material in the phenomenological tradition that could also be of huge value for those discussions. So I thank you very much for your attention.
Muchas gracias, Dr. Zahavi.
Thank you very
Muchas
much.
gracias por su presentación tan clara y tan instructiva. Vamos a dar ahora entonces apertura al intercambio con los participantes. Voy a presentar brevemente a Carlos Ruta y a Maximiliano Kladakis, que van a dar el inicio de este intercambio, y luego quienes quieran participar pueden anotar en el chat o bien su nombre o bien su pregunta, y la leemos entonces en voz alta o levantan la mano, como prefieran. Carlos Ruta es doctor en filosofía, se dedica a temas de hermenéutica desde el medioevo hasta la actualidad. Esto lo llevó a cruzar pensamientos, reflexiones desde la filosofía, la teología y la teoría de la creación poética. Autores a los que se dedicó, entre otros, son Meister Eckhart, Michel Henry, Gadamer, etc. Maximiliano es además profesor en la carrera de filosofía de la Escuela de Humanidades de esta casa y es director del centro en el cual nos encontramos, el Centro de Estudios de Hermenéutica de la UNSAM. Maximiliano Kladakis es también doctor en filosofía, se dedica a la fenomenología y a la hermenéutica, y su ámbito de estudio, sobre todo, y de investigación, es la fenomenología francesa de posguerra. Sus autores más, podemos decir, preferidos son Merleau-Ponty y Sartre. Les doy entonces la palabra.
Bueno, I will speak Spanish then. Bueno, muchas gracias, Dan, por la exposición, que enriquece mucho el debate en relación a tus otros textos anteriores. Quisiera hacerte una pregunta o plantearte una inquietud para escuchar tu opinión al respecto, y es en relación al lenguaje. Has hablado de las acciones comunes, compartidas. Has hablado también de las emociones compartidas o comunes, pero ambas, en definitiva, podría uno decir que están envueltas en nuestra experiencia del lenguaje, en tanto están envueltas en un sentido que hace que ellas sean tanto propias como comunes. Mi inquietud es la siguiente. Nuestro ingreso al lenguaje, pregunto, nuestro ingreso al lenguaje, ¿no es el ingreso a un nosotros compartido? Y ese ingreso a un nosotros compartidos es la única posibilidad, o desde dónde venimos, para que sea posible una palabra nuestra. Entonces, como que apropiarnos de nuestra propia palabra, asumir esta palabra como mía, necesita ese salir de esa palabra común y distanciarse de esa palabra común. Este proceso el que me preocupa y me interesa por varias razones. En primer lugar, podría decir y es uno de los fenómenos complejos de la vida contemporánea. Ya Heidegger lo mencionaba en Ser y Tiempo, hablando del man, y es decir, ese lenguaje que compartimos sin que sea nuestro, donde en ese momento el nosotros es casi un anonimato. Y cómo entonces ese apropiarse de sí mismo y llegar a la conciencia de sí mismo, o a la experiencia de sí mismo, requiere ese juego circular, casi dialéctico, del lenguaje de todos, el lenguaje común y el lenguaje propio. Nada más.
Yes, I will try. So I think that I would distinguish different questions. I mean, on the one hand, there is a question about the relationship as a result of becoming a competent language user, as a result of being introduced and socialized into a specific language. I want to distinguish that kind of sharing with the kind of with a different kind of sharing that occurs in the here and now between different subjects. I think one might talk about sharing in both cases, but I think there's an important difference between me somehow being the carrier of a certain communal heritage by speaking a certain language, and me either performing a joint action with somebody because we are carrying a table, or me laughing together with another because we just heard a joke. I mean, in both cases, one might talk about sharing, but I think there are some very important differences between the kind of sharing that is going on in those cases. So at least we shouldn't conflate them. I think we need to keep them apart. I think that would be the first point I would want to make. The second point would be the question of whether this introduction into a common language, whether that is the only way. No, actually, let me just say one more thing, because interestingly, I mean, what one can find in Husserl, I mean, is a huge. I mean, for those who knows Husserl, this won't come as a surprise. But I mean, there are so many distinctions, and so, for instance, he also talks about different types of communities. There are instinctual communities, natural communities, artificial communities, strategic communities. He interestingly also talks about language community as a specific type of community. And I think, I mean, one interesting question one might ask would be the kind of we. I mean, if we want to say that simply being a member of a specific language community, if we want to say that means that we are a member of a certain we, I think we have to recognize that a language community is a very, I mean, normally, I mean, I'm sure that there are, of course, also language communities that consist of very, very few speakers. But I mean, if we are talking about Spanish or English or French, of course, being a member of that language community is a very, very abstract type of we. I mean, it's very different from belonging to a specific village or a specific family or a specific interest group. So again, talking of we's, I mean, it also illustrates the need for distinguishing between a whole set of different we's with different scopes and different foci. But then there was this question that was asked by Carlos, whether being introduced into a language, whether that is the only way, at least that's the way I understood it, whether that is the only way to become a proper we member, or a proper member of a we. And I have to say that here my phenomenological kind of inclination perhaps shows itself, and this might be where perhaps people who are more interested in hermeneutics might not agree. But I mean, I am very fond of also pre-predicative experience. I don't think intentionality and self-experience only starts with language. So what I would want to say is that language certainly permits much richer, much more enduring types of we's. I mean, without language, I mean, there wouldn't be long-lasting we's. I'm absolutely convinced of that. But I must also say that I think there are forms of we's that are possible outside of language, independently of language. I think that developmental psychology can potentially support that view. And I would even go so far as to say that I'm not sure that we could even acquire a language were it not for the fact that something like pre-linguistic joint attention is possible. I mean, I don't see how an infant could ever acquire language, competence if it wasn't able to attend to the words that was introduced to it by its caretakers, and in those cases there would be a certain joint attention, even though the child or the infant had not yet any capacity to actually understand what was being said. So I think there are many instances of pre-linguistic joint attention, and I think there are ways of also effectively being connected that are not dependent upon language. But I'm fully prepared to concede that language transforms and enrich the kind of communities we can participate in. Yeah, I think I will stop there.
Thank you very much.
Bien, ante todo, muchas gracias por la exposición, muy clara, muy precisa y al mismo tiempo muy movilizante para el pensamiento y la reflexión filosófica y también para el establecimiento de un diálogo con diversas disciplinas. Yo quería hacerle al profesor dos preguntas para ver qué piensa, una de tipo metodológico, otro de tipo ético, una pregunta metodológica y una pregunta ética. Con respecto a la metodológica, la idea de una intencionalidad colectiva me parece muy sugerente, muy movilizante, como ya dije anteriormente, para el pensamiento. Ahora, si usted piensa, si se puede... Hay un término que emplea Leonard Lawlor para referirse al pensamiento de Foucault y de Merleau-Ponty, que es el de una arqueología filosófica, de un movimiento arqueológico regresivo. Es decir, en este sentido, quizás de manera tradicional, de manera del pensamiento cartesiano en adelante, se piensa como punto de partida metodológico la subjetividad, para a partir de ahí, de manera teleológica progresiva, pensar la intersubjetividad como una relación intermonádica. Ahora bien, el movimiento arqueológico regresivo empleado por Lawlor, implicaría pensar de la subjetividad, vamos hacia atrás, ¿no? Y para ver empleo una terminología merleau-pontiana, más acá de la subjetividad, no más allá, y ahí encontrar la intersubjetividad, ¿no? Como ese suelo del cual emerge la vida personal. Sí, bueno, la pregunta sería, ¿qué piensa con respecto a este método, este camino de retorno, este camino arqueológico? Y después la segunda es, me parece muy convocante, esta idea de una responsabilidad colectiva, se hizo mención a Hannah Arendt, ¿no? Y que implica una dificultad de diferenciar, ¿no? Entre, de manera clara y distinta, de manera cartesiana, la responsabilidad individual y aquello que nos precede, pero de lo cual somos responsables también, ¿no? Quizás de manera pasiva o no. Y en este sentido, quería preguntarle si se puede articular en algún punto este lema quizás existencialista de cada uno es responsable de todo ante todos, con un somos, a pesar de cada uno, responsables de todo ante todos. ¿Y cómo se articularía esta responsabilidad particular con esta responsabilidad de tipo colectiva? Sobre todo no pensando en las grandes crisis humanitarias, etc. Esas serían mis dos preguntas.
Okay, I think I will find it a bit easier to answer the first. I'm still thinking about the second. So about the first question, I mean, I think one has to distinguish two different options, and I have to say I disagree with both of them, but I think that conceptually it's important to distinguish two different proposals. The first proposal is that intersubjectivity gives rise to subjectivity or gives rise to individuality or subjectivity. So intersubjectivity is the foundation that gives rise to subjectivity. That's the first proposal. The other proposal is that there is something undifferentiated, anonymous, collective that gives rise to subjectivity. Now, why do I want to distinguish those two proposals? Well, that's because I think the first proposal, the idea that intersubjectivity gives rise to subjectivity, I think that's just incoherent from a kind of conceptual point of view, because what does intersubjectivity mean? I mean, intersubjectivity, I mean, it means the relationship between subjects. And so in order to make sense of what that term refers to, I think we have to have subjects there. I mean, so I just can't, you know, I can't really make sense of the idea that intersubjectivity should somehow be the foundation. So I think if one is kind of interested in somehow deconstructing or criticizing or, you know, challenging the so-called Cartesian mode of thinking, I think one should rather go for the other option. So don't talk about intersubjectivity, but talk about anonymous existence or some kind of undifferentiatedness, which is also something that Merleau-Ponty occasionally does. So I think that's more, I mean, I don't think that's, you know, incoherent from the outset, but I just have to say that I have never been able to, I've just never seen a plausible explanation for how this undifferentiated anonymity is supposed to allow for proper subjectivity. I mean, and I might be blinded or I might be biased, but I mean, I mean, this is a topic that I've been working on since my doctoral dissertation on intersubjectivity in the 90s. So this is more than 25 years ago. And even though I'm a strong supporter of intersubjectivity and I've written much on it, I mean, the idea that I mean, despite that interest in intersubjectivity, I have to admit that I am to some extent, I mean, very Husserlian in my way of thinking. I don't know whether we should call it Cartesian, I mean, because it's always used as some kind of criticism. And even though, I mean, I remember, I mean, I have a good friend, friend who's an analytic philosopher who likes Descartes a lot, and he doesn't understand why calling something Cartesian is supposed to be an accusation. He's just thinking, well, that's great because Descartes was a great philosopher. But I mean, let's push that aside. And I just want to confirm, I mean, that I want to confirm my Husserlian kind of inclination. I really do think that there is something about subjectivity that is irreducible. I mean, I can see why a rich account of subjectivity has, of course, to consider context and language and history and tradition and all of that. But there is something in experience that I think we have to recognize as not further explainable. And I mean, for all the people who are saying that, you know, collectivity or anonymity or whatever is at the outset and that somehow gives rise to individual subjectivity, I just want to challenge them to come up with an explanation of how that move actually happens. And I can only say I've never been convinced by any of the different models I've been presented with. Okay, then there's the issue of collective responsibility, which I find a little bit harder to reply to, since ethics. I mean, I'm really not working on ethics or moral philosophy. I mean, so I think I can only kind of make two quick comments. I mean, one comment would be, I mean, when talking about collective responsibility, I'm thinking about, you know, the notion of collective guilt, and thinking about, for instance, you know, post-war Germans who felt collective guilt. And of course, one could ask, I mean, why talk about guilt from a generation who were not themselves perpetrating all the, you know, terrible things that happened during the Second World War? And perhaps one way to understand, or one way to justify talking of collective guilt in this regard would be by saying that even if they weren't themselves perpetrators, by being part of that community, I mean, they have also profited from, I mean, insofar as they have profited from being a member of that community, perhaps responsibility follows from that. I mean, perhaps that's one way to make, I mean, to make it understandable how we can talk about, you know, guilt even from people who haven't been directly, you know, directly responsible. So, I mean, that's just one quick thought. But then there's another thought, and I don't know, I mean, I think perhaps one should distinguish a little bit. I mean, perhaps one should distinguish between being responsible for something on the one hand, and on the other hand, having kind of an ethical duty. I mean, I think, you know, I'm very much in favor of a universalistic ethics. So I do think we have a duty, a moral duty, not just to our own community members, but also to humanity at large. Now, whether that is, I just think that seems to be perhaps, I mean, a notion of responsibility that is a bit different from the other. It's not about me being responsible for the consequences of something I have done, or me being responsible for what my ancestors have done. I mean, it's a very different notion of responsibility that really has to do with, I mean, perhaps duty. It might sound a bit Kantian here, but I mean, I recognize that one normally talks about moral responsibility, but I guess it just dawns on me that this is, of course, a very different notion of responsibility than the other one, and perhaps one should just be clear about that. But so just to make it clear, I mean, I certainly think that our moral responsibility goes beyond whatever in-group we are a member of, and that perhaps to that extent one can talk about humanity at large as also a very, you know, abstract we group, but also one we kind of have to consider. I mean, as probably my replies made evident, I mean, it's not really topics that I'm working on, so I apologize for the somewhat preliminary character of the answers.
Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. Tenemos un comentario en el chat de Eric Zapp, que quien prefiera leerlo en inglés también lo puede hacer, y dice: un feto es miembro de nosotros antes de su nacimiento. Aunque sea la conciencia primitiva dentro del útero, no se articula lingüísticamente. Por ejemplo, la madre dice: nosotros vamos a dar un paseo. El feto no tiene ninguna comprensión de su papel. Entonces, el modo sociolingüístico del nosotros, que incluye al feto como un referente, hay muchas otras formas, por supuesto, es anterior a la génesis de la individualidad en primera persona del niño, pero también depende de una existencia social de la madre. En nosotros se habla de nosotros antes de nosotros hablamos. Mutatis mutandis, la madre puede referir al feto como tú antes de la capacidad del feto pueda imaginar su madre como una persona distinta. Entonces, la concepción recíproca de ich und du y de cara a cara es un caso avanzado, pero no es caso primordial.
Thank you. So I have to say that I just disagree very fundamentally, because you are, of course, right in saying that a mother might refer to herself and the features by using the first person plural we. I mean, that is certainly the case, but I also think we have to recognize that the notion of we can be used wrongly. I mean, I might think of myself as member of a we, even though I'm not recognized by the other members as a proper member, and in that case, I'm, so to speak, using the we mistakenly. I mean, and likewise, other people can refer to me and include me in their we, even though I'm not prepared to acknowledge it or accept it. And I think in that case as well, it wouldn't be a proper we. So I mean, my intuition is clearly that if the mother is talking about herself and the fetus using the first person plural, and if the fetus has absolutely no awareness of what is going on, I wouldn't consider that to be a proper case of a we. And likewise, also when the mother addresses the fetus as you, I would consider that to be a kind of parasitic or non-genuine type of second person engagement, because there's no way for, I mean, if we presuppose, which I guess is plausible, that the fetus has no awareness of being addressed, has no way of taking up the address, and has no way of responding to the address. I mean, if all of that is absent, again, I wouldn't recognize it as a proper second person engagement. I mean, in principle, I mean, we could take a lot of other examples as well. I mean, it doesn't have to be a fetus. It could also be an animal. It might even be, you know, to actually take an example that I recently read, it could be a piece of clay. I mean, imagine a potter who sits down in front of the clay and say, you know, now we are going to create something together. I mean, that's an interesting way of talking, but I don't think that suggests that there is really a we between the clay and the potter who wants to form the clay into a pot or a vase. So I mean, I take your point as exemplifying that there are uses of the we in ordinary language that I didn't address in my talk, but my way of responding to the objections or the counterexamples would basically be by denying that they are genuine forms of we and genuine forms of you.
Muchas gracias, doctor Zahavi. Hay una pregunta de Gabriel Brarda que dice, ¿no es necesaria la díada de attachment con una figura privilegiada para la constitución de un self? En ese caso, ¿sería lo diádico lo primero, la primacía originaria, luego lo interpersonal, social, antecedería a lo intrasubjetivo individual? ¿La leo de vuelta o...?
Yes, please. Okay, please.
Sí. ¿No es necesaria la díada de attachment con una figura privilegiada para la constitución de un self?
¿Cómo una figura privilegiada?
Sí, perdón. Como una figura privilegiada para la constitución del self. En ese caso sería lo diádico, lo primario, la primacía originaria, luego lo interpersonal, lo social, antecedería a lo intrasubjetivo individual.
Okay, I think I understood it, but I think that I think I would question the basic premise, namely that we need an attachment to a privileged other in order to become a self. And I mean, again, I didn't really have time to spell that out in any detail, but I think that this idea, I mean, this Husserlian idea of experiences always somehow being owned, not being anonymous, having a first-person character from the outset, qua experiences. I mean, that's the guiding idea behind the rejection of the claim that the dyad and the relationship to a significant, or the attachment to a significant other, is somehow the starting point. I mean, there is one book that I could recommend in this case is a book by Daniel Stern, The Interpersonal World of the Infant, which actually is a book that has been very influential in my own way of thinking. And before saying how that came about, let me just mention that one of the claims that Stern makes, so the book came out in 1985, one of the claims that Stern makes is that he's basically rejecting certain ideas from psychoanalysis concerning the primacy of some kind of dyad or some kind of symbiosis prior to the emergence of individual selfhood. And what Stern is arguing for is the existence of a certain core self from the outset, and he thinks that that is something that developmental psychology had somehow shown. And the reason why the book has been so influential to me is that, if you will allow me that small digression, is that when I wrote my doctoral thesis on Husserl and intersubjectivity, I was very much concerned with defending a phenomenological account of intersubjectivity, but my whole discussion was exclusively philosophical. And I think a year after I had defended my thesis, I then stumbled upon Stern's book. And what I found in that book was very much an argument along the very same line as I had made, namely defending the existence of kind of pre-linguistic forms of intersubjectivity and arguing that intersubjectivity presupposes a fundamental, basically the existence of fundamental selves. But of course, Stern's argument was primarily supported by evidence from developmental psychology. And it was just an eye-opener to me to realize that, of course, there are other disciplines than philosophy who have been interested in issues related to self and other and sociality and intersubjectivity. And so, what really happened was that I moved from being a philosopher that really only and exclusively worked with philosophical texts, partly as a result of reading Stern's book. I became much more interested in interdisciplinary collaboration. And I mean, since then, I've collaborated with so many different disciplines. And I think today, I'm to some extent less interested in also writing only for a small group of philosophers. I mean, I find it much more rewarding also to write work that could potentially be of interest to people outside of academic philosophy. So I mean, Stern's book that I strongly recommend has been very influential. And I think that he basically disputes the idea that the dyad precedes individual subjectivity. Yeah.
Muchas gracias. Horacio Fontana le pregunta si podría extender su apreciación de la lectura de la mente del otro u otros.
Okay, so the term mind reading, is that what the question concerns? Because I think I used the term mind reading once. Is that what the question concerns?
Sí, no.
Okay. Okay, good. Okay, so mind reading, I mean, yeah, that might sound like a strange term, but it's a term that has been used by a number of cognitive scientists to basically describe interpersonal understanding. So the idea would be, when I understand, if I'm trying to understand what goes on in the mind of the other, this is supposed to be a form of mind reading. So it's a kind of technical term. I find the term very unfortunate for the following reason. I don't think that reading is a very good metaphor for how we understand others. Why not? Because reading is something we acquire in the course of life. Initially, the letters and the sentences are completely incomprehensible. And then by learning certain conventions, we are then able to kind of get meaning out of them. And I think some of the people who talk about mind reading when discussing social cognition, I mean, they are basically motivated by very similar assumptions, namely the assumption that what we are initially confronted with is basically behavioral movements with no psychological significance. And then we basically have to start to employ rich theories in order to interpret those meaningless movements into some kind of psychologically meaningful, action. So I find the term mind reading very problematic, but typically it's being used in the cognitive science literature to talk of interpersonal understanding as something that requires fairly elaborate cognitive or intellectual kind of capacities. So that's what the term is used for.
Muchas gracias. La profesora Paula Pico le pregunta al profesor si podría repetir el nombre del libro de Stean.
Yes, The Interpersonal World of the Infant. Is that clear?
Muchas gracias. Y entonces tenemos una pregunta de Santiago, ya casi Santiago Casares, para casi ir cerrando nuestro encuentro. Santiago.
Thank you so much, Dan, for, it's okay that I do it in English, right? I'm being translated in Spanish, no? Yes, Laura?
En el idioma que prefieras.
Okay. Well, since your exposition was in English, I'll try to do it in English, so because my notes are in English. Thank you so much. I actually have the same concern and wrote my thesis on somewhat of a similar subject. The thing is, I have a copy, somewhat of a question slash suggestion. I'll start with a question, the kind of dyadic question I have, binomic, which is in your reading, and I understand you've worked this a lot, of empathy, that has been translated. I'm sure you're familiar with Levinas's translation of the Husserl's Cartesian Meditations, and he actually translates empathy somewhat of something like anthropathy, something that suggests there's something internal about the notion of the we. So I always thought that Husserl's we could be summarized in something like you as I. So something like you means you as, as I. So there's something about this transcendental we that is inside the ego, because that is never, the other is never accessible in itself, but only I understand myself. He must be something like I am. No, I understand. So the as is the link between me and you, right? So it seems to me that this we is very conditioned by the I. Huh? The we, something is, okay. So it seems to me, and this is the question, isn't this somewhat insufficient or weak definition of the we? So why go to Husserl if we can't really access the other one? So I understand us because I understand myself. So there's something very active in the I that might damage the we. This is the first part.
Sure.
The second part of the question is Heidegger, right? And you said at a certain point, well, I don't have time. Maybe we have like 5 minutes. We'll give you 5 minutes for the we. I understand the we in Heidegger, something like you with me, the definition of we for Heidegger.
Sure.
But the key aspect of this definition, we is I with you, is the fact that there is something irreplaceable about you and me, that is, in Heidegger's terms, something like being toward death or something like that. No one can die in my place. No? So there's something, no one can live my life. So in the we cannot replace each other. It has to be Dan, Santiago, Maxi, Carlos. Each one is going to die his own death and live his own life, consequently, right? So in this definition, there's a problem as well, because I mean, we can't really access the inter-subject experience. But we still, at least we have what can you say, a respect, a solidarity of this irreplaceableness of the other. And this question goes with the suggestion, I guess. And I guess I didn't think this was going to be this long. This is the absence in your research, and I'm not sure if this is an absence or it was an absence here,
Sure.
of the contemporary phenomenological French efforts. And I mean, I think someone said, maybe Horacio suggested the Levinas, no? Emmanuel Levinas, and Maxi as well. But Jean-Luc Marion, no? And the love, because you talked about love in Husserl, so why not a Heideggerian point of view? So my question in this suggestion to include these thinkers that actually think the we from the dyad, me and you, but the whole effort of this contemporary phenomenology is to have a passive I. That is, maybe we don't know if we has an erotic precedence or an ethical precedence, but at least we can say that that the I, no, there's no I in team kind of thing, that the I will be passive in the eventfulness of the we, so that at least the thing we can tell, either if it's erotic or ethical, is that I am very small in face of the we, either because the we is before, or because the we is, I mean, ethically, erotically, ontologically, consciously, always it comes before. But and I'm thinking of Claude Romano, the phenomenologist. I'm thinking, well, maybe the thing is that is. Ya terminó. ¿Qué pasó? ¿Me fui?
No, como nos quedan, perdón la interrupción, pocos minutos, ¿querés formular
Ya
las
estaba
preguntas?
terminando. Estaba terminando. Sí.
Perdón.
That is, the eventfulness of the we will always crush the I. So not look, to look into the we have to think of a very passive and a very weak I in order to get to the we as a phenomenon. Thank you. I'm sorry for that.
No, I mean, I wish we had more than just 5 minutes to discuss this, because obviously you have brought up a lot of very interesting questions and suggestions. I'm just trying to think how to best structure my reply. I mean, so I mean, well, let me just, it might be a little bit kind of erratic, but first of all, the French translation of empathy, I mean, that is of course coming from the German term Einfühlung. I mean, so it has the very same connotations in German. And I think one of the reasons why Heidegger became critical, and I didn't have time to discuss that, one of the reasons why Heidegger is critical of the notion of empathy and basically dismisses the suggestion that empathy is the key to understanding something like a we, is because he thinks that Einfühlung is a question of me somehow trying to get into the mind of the other. And what he wants to say is, this is a Cartesian fabrication, because I'm not first inside my own head and then I have to go into the head of the other. No, on the contrary, we always already find ourselves in a common world, and that's where something like a we is possible. So there are a lot of this, I mean, again, I don't have time. There's a lot of interesting discussions about what role empathy can play. Now, having said that, I mean, part of what you said about the difference between Husserl and Heidegger, I actually found a bit funny, because I mean, you insisted upon Heidegger ascribing, I mean, the you, I mean, basically arguing that the you is irreplaceable. So the way you were presenting Heidegger is suddenly turned into a thinker of alterity, somebody who really respects the otherness of the other, because the you is irreplaceable. Now, of course, Levinas would never agree with that. Levinas would argue that Heidegger is a thinker of totality, and that if you want to find a previous thinker who respects the alterity of the other, it's actually Husserl. So I think that Husserl actually keeps insisting upon the transcendence of the other. So when Husserl says, well, there is something in the other that I cannot grasp, that I cannot access, that's exactly his way of highlighting the fact that the other is not under my control. The other remains transcendent. And so I actually think that there are some interesting parallels between Husserl and Levinas here. And I think this is something that Derrida very clearly saw in what is my favorite piece by him, Violence in Metaphysics, which I think is a wonderful discussion of the relationship between Husserl and Levinas. So to put it differently, I mean, I actually think that Husserl recognizes the difference between I and you. I think, I mean, what he does say is that a you must itself be an I. So a you must be a self in its own rights. That's what allows it to become a you. I don't think that Husserl would say that the you is a part of my I, or depends on my I. I mean, if he said that, the whole model would kind of basically break down. So I think that, I mean, so I would probably view the relationship between Husserl and Heidegger a bit differently than you, but I would agree that I guess this is a way of kind of bringing it to a close. I mean, I would agree that it's important to recognize the passive dimension. I think that is absolutely true. But But I also think there is an important, because it was kind of interesting when you were talking about some of the contemporary French thinkers. I mean, you were saying they only want to attribute a small role to the I. And I think that's, but I think that's very important. I mean, I think there's a difference between doing away with the I completely and saying, well, it has a role to play. It might not be a major role, but it's an indispensable role. I mean, it's a role that we cannot do without, even if it might not be a very big one. And I actually kind of like to read Husserl a bit in the same way. I mean, what Husserl insists upon is that subjectivity, you cannot kind of get it off the table, but it's not as if, I mean, he would never say, contrary to all kinds of misinterpretations, if we only have subjectivity, then we can explain everything else, as if everything else is just my production. I don't think Husserl would say that, but he would say subjectivity is something that we need to factor in any account of reality, sociality, whatever. So to kind of just wrap up, I mean, I agree with you. I think you with me, I mean, I like the width. I think that's precisely what we need to factor in. I think Husserl has somehow the resources to do that. And I would also agree that, I mean, some of the later phenomenologists are undoubtedly relevant. The only thing I would want to add that I'm more interested in, to be quite honest, I'm more interested in Lévinas and Derrida than in Marion and Romano. So I'm not sure that what you find in contemporary French phenomenology, if I may say so, is of the same magnitude as the earlier generation, unfortunately. But I mean, that's just my own verdict. So.
Muchas gracias, Santi. Bueno, entonces, Carlos, no sé si querés despedirte de Dan. Maxi,
muchas gracias, Dan. Y espero que este sea el primer encuentro de una serie de discusiones sobre tu trabajo que nos interesa muchísimo. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias a todos, a todas, y los esperamos en nuestros próximos encuentros. Buen fin de semana.
Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
So much. Greetings from Copenhagen.
Gracias. Muchas gracias.